Welcome to Listen Here, the audiobook podcast where we bring you chapter listens of our much-loved audiobooks and sometimes special guest appearances. Known to millions as simply Sister Jean, the Loyola Chicago matriarch and college basketball icon invites you into her remarkable memoir filled with history, wonder, and common sense wisdom for this century and beyond. As Sister Jean wisely says, I've seen so many changes in the last 102 years, but the most important things remain the same. Part life story, part philosophy text, and part spiritual guide, Sister Jean's wit, wisdom, and common sense has broad appeal and application that transcends religious creed, belief, and even feelings on Loyola's basketball team. Along with her collaborator, Seth Davis, an award-winning writer, broadcaster, and New York Times bestselling author, Wake Up with Purpose lets you experience Sister Jean's words and her spirit, her sharp sense of humor, life lessons gleaned from 100 years of living, universal themes that connect us all, and priceless wisdom. The driving force inside Wake Up with Purpose is the narrative of Sister Jean's fascinating life, from teaching at a Catholic school during the Second World War, to serving on a Chicago college campus in the 60s and beyond, to cheering from the sidelines of a men's basketball tournament in March of 2018. As you learn about Sister Jean's century-long life, you'll feel just like the Loyola students do when they knock on her office door, plop down in a chair, and ask if she would have time to chat, an activity she still does daily. Now, here's a sample of Wake Up with Purpose by Sister Jean.
A reading of the prologue of Wake Up with Purpose, read by Sister Jean. My alarm clock goes off each morning at 5 a.m. It takes me a couple of seconds to shake off the cobwebs. Then I sit up quickly. If I don't, I could fall back to sleep. Can't let that happen. I've got too much to do. First, though, I say a prayer. I put my feet on the floor and sit on the edge of my bed. Oh God, thank you for bringing me this day and for having me serve you once again. I then get myself cleaned and dressed and into my wheelchair. I don't use the wheelchair because I'm old. I broke my hip and then I got shingles. I am hoping the chair is only temporary, but I'm not complaining. I know I'm blessed to have the chair and the ability to move those wheels, as well as plenty of people who are willing to push me around. Now that I'm clean and settled, I can begin my daily 30-minute morning meditation. I take out my iPad and open an application from the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where I study my gospel reading for the day. I guess there aren't too many 103-year-old nuns using iPads these days. There aren't too many 103-year-old nuns, period. But I'm pretty comfortable with modern technology. I've always said, if you're not moving forward, you're going to get left behind real quick. Adaptability is my superpower. I actually think the iPad is a wonderful way to absorb scripture. It's light and it fits easily into my hands. Beside each reading is reflection from a theologian, which encapsulates that day's section. So I indulge in that text too. It gives me a deeper understanding and appreciation as I read the ancient words. My reading done, I sit and reflect. When I was studying to be a sister, I learned to set aside time each day to sit quietly and think. Now, if I notice I'm distracted, which is natural, I try to get myself back to God. When you have so much on your mind, it's easy to be distracted. We're human beings, after all. Finally, I set aside the iPad and I look out the window of my apartment at the Clare an assisted living facility for senior citizens in downtown Chicago. The city is so peaceful at this early hour. There's a hotel across the street, and I see the lights in the rooms start to come on. I think about the people waking up in those rooms, and I pray that they will find joy on this day that the Lord has made. I can see a corner of Lake Michigan peeking out behind the hotel. I call that my piece of the lake. Sometimes when the water is nice and calm, I can see sailboats out there. I think about those people on those boats and pray that they will be safe and enjoy their time on the water. As I continue to pray and meditate, I consider my work for the day. I go over my schedule so I know what I have to look forward to. I try to be as specific as I can at the start, even though I know not everything will go according to what I have laid out. I reflect on what's going to be good about the day, as well as what I'm not looking forward to. And that's okay, though, because I know whatever problems come up, they will be resolved. I trust that God has His plan in place. This adjusts my mindset for the day. I think we could all be a little happier and more productive if we set aside quiet time, especially at the start of our day. Even 5 or 10 minutes of silent reflection can be enough. I did this for many years as an 8th grade teacher. I would begin my class by asking my students to put their heads down on their desks while I read from the gospel. This calmed them down. At first, I did this for 5 minutes. Eventually, I extended it to 10. Then at the end of the class, we would sit quietly for a few additional minutes, for everyone could think about what had been read. St. Ignatius of Loyola, the 15th century Spanish priest who founded the religious order of the Society of Jesus, also known as Jesuits, was a great advocate for quiet. He devised the daily examen prayer to be said during the course of the day. The examen provides for silent reflection, thanksgiving, petition, review, response, and a prayer for tomorrow. Today, millions of Catholics around the world say their examen at least once a day. There are few rituals that bring me more peace. Perhaps my favorite place to pray is Madonna della Strada Chapel on Loyola campus. It is a quiet place that is conducive to prayer. Even though many visitors come and go, I experience quiet, alone time with God. And I believe that He listens to me as I talk to Him about my friends, my activities, and what I hope to do in my ministry at Loyola. Other times I like to sit by the lake and enjoy the beauties our God has created and shared with all of us. I thank Him for such gifts. Along with that time for reflection, I also understand we all need a pat on the back once in a while, including from ourselves. Before I go to sleep each night, I think of all the good things I did that day. That way I know I will wake up happy in the morning. Although, let's face it, at my age, I'm always happy when I wake up. And when I do, I sit up, start my morning ritual all over again, awash in gratitude that once again God has empowered me to wake up with purpose. When I turned 100 years old, August 21st, 2019, the city of Chicago and my employer, Loyola University, threw a big party for me. There's nothing I enjoy more than a big party, especially when I'm the guest of honor. One of the local reporters asked our basketball coach, Porter Moser, how I'd lived so long and so happily. Well, I'll tell you, he replied. She has a purpose every day. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Of course, there's always a lot of luck involved in living this long. I'm extremely blessed that I've never gotten terribly sick or badly hurt. I've also clearly inherited great DNA. My father lived until he was 95, and my brothers lived until they were 74 and 90 years old. I do think having a daily constant purpose has kept me not only alive, but young and vibrant. I've always loved my work because it never feels like work. To this day, I report for work at Loyola University Chicago 5 days a week. My office sits right in the heart of our student center, so these magnificent young people are constantly popping in and out of my office to ask questions, to say hello, to request a selfie. I am the queen of selfies these days. My evenings are filled with phone calls, reading and writing emails. Yes, I write my own emails. I like to think that I've got just as much, if not more, energy as people who are many years my junior. I only wish I could jump out of this wheelchair and dance a jig. I can't say I plan to live this long or decided a course of action that would allow this to happen. I just allowed my instincts and my calling to service God. This intention first popped into my head when I was a third grader attending Catholic school in San Francisco. My teacher was a Sister of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and I announced that I wanted to be just like her. I never looked back. I was 18 years old when I entered the BVM Mother House in 1937, and I have been an educator ever since. For the first 20 years of my career, I taught at an elementary school, mostly in my native California. And when I started, I taught 5th grade and later moved to 8th grade. Besides being a teacher, I was also an administrator, principal, basketball coach, as well as coaching other sports. In 1961, I moved to Mundelein College, an all-women's college in Chicago. 30 years after that, Mundelein affiliated with Loyola University. I have worked there ever since. I've had many duties at Loyola over the last 3 decades, but none has brought me more joy than my service as a chaplain for the men's basketball team. I meet with the team before every game to offer a prayer. I also pray with the fans shortly before tip-off. Then I watch the action from my wheelchair right next to the court. From where I sit, I can see everything that happens, including the instances when the referees make a bad call. And I pray that those guys will get better eyesight. Sometimes a player will stop by and hug me on their way off the court. There's nothing like hugging a sweaty basketball player after a big win. I may be an old nun, but I know my hoops. On the day after each game, I send emails to the coaches and the players offering my analysis of the game and a scouting report for our upcoming opponent. I know basketball well, having watched it all these years, and I make sure to do my homework. Then before the next game, we meet again, and I pray for everyone to be safe and healthy and for the Ramblers to win. I often see looks of surprise on the guys' faces when they hear some of the things I say. One of our players, Dante Ingram, once told the reporter how surprised he was when he heard me deliver a pre-game prayer for the first time. It caught me off guard, he said. I thought she was going to pray. Oh, she prayed, and then she starts saying, "You've got to box out and watch out for number 23. I've been blessed to be well known in the Loyola community for quite some time, but in the spring of 2018, I reached a level of notoriety that I never could have imagined when my Ramblers made a Cinderella run to the Final Four of the NCAA tournament. Every time we took the court, we were the underdogs, but our guys showed such great fight and teamwork that we were able to win 4 straight games. As they took each step, the press developed a bigger fascination with the old nun in the wheelchair wearing a maroon and gold scarf and a pair of Nike sneakers with the words Sister and Jean stitched onto them. By the time we all arrived in San Antonio for the Final Four, I was such a big deal that the NCAA set up my own press conference. They told me afterward I drew more reporters than Tom Brady did at the Super Bowl. At one point, a reporter asked how I felt to be a national celebrity. International celebrity, I corrected. That's because I had received emails from Europe from friends who had caught wind of my story across the pond. This nun was flying. The tournament ended with a loss to Michigan in the Final Four. I was disappointed, of course, but I was so thrilled with what our players had done and what they accomplished. Life was calmed down for me over the years, but then only for a while. I'm still treated like a celebrity, and I must say I do enjoy it because it gives me a chance to interact with so many people. People tease me from time to time. Now, Sister Jean, don't let this go to your head. But of course it hasn't. I believe this was all part of God's plan. All I ever wanted to do was to serve God, and my way of doing that has been to work with young people, to educate them, to encourage them, to give them spiritual guidance, and help them live out their dreams. I've seen so many changes over the last century, but the important things have remained the same. My attitude and perspective haven't changed since Loyola's amazing run to the Final Four, but I recognize that I have a much bigger audience now. I feel it is my duty to take advantage of this holy opportunity. That is my aim in writing this book, not only to tell the story of my life, but also to talk about the things I learned during my first 100 years. I hope to do what I've always wanted, use my words to help others to learn, grow, serve God, and serve each other. I hope when people read this book, they will be able to wake up the way I do. I want them to wake up happy. I want them to wake up with a purpose. And I want the Ramblers to win.
1. It starts with belief. If you keep your faith, you never have to grow old. I recently came upon an African proverb that said, when an old person dies, a library closes. I thought that was such a beautiful verse. And by that logic, if the old person is still living, that means the library is open, right? That's a pleasant way to imagine myself. I'd like to think I have information to share and stories to tell that could be helpful and inspirational to others. And you don't need a library card to hear my stories. All you have to do is pull up a chair and ask. As someone who was born just 9 months after World War I, I've seen a great deal. My earliest memory stretches back to when I was 2.5 years old. It was April of 1922, and my grandmother had just died. My brother Ed had been born that January, and several days before the funeral, he came down with a bad case of whooping cough. He had caught it from me, and my mother was concerned because babies have a hard time getting rid of phlegm. I distinctly remember being at the cemetery and seeing someone bring a folding chair for my mother so she didn't have to stand while holding the baby. The next day, my brother stopped coughing. My mother told me it was because Grandma had cured him. This was how it was for our family. Everything started with belief. Although I was sad that my grandma had died, my mother encouraged me by telling me Grandma was already with God in heaven and was helping to keep us safe and healthy. My dad taught us that God made the stars and the skies and that He loved us. He was always watching over us and He wanted us to be happy. Of course, that doesn't mean that everything will go our way, but if we hold on to that belief, we can trust that God has a reason for everything that happens, even if we don't quite understand it at the time. That's an easy concept to grasp when you're 2.5 years old, but it gets harder to understand as we get older. It's like what is said about the angel Clarence at the beginning of the classic Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. He's got the faith of a child. Wouldn't it be nice if someone could always say that about us? That's why every day of my life, I've sought to reaffirm my belief and reestablish my faith. That's how it works with God. If you keep your faith, you never have to grow old. I've always had a pretty good memory, almost too good. When I was in first grade, I didn't read books so much as memorize them. If I had to read in front of the class, I would purposely hold the book upside down to show off to my fellow students that I wasn't actually reading it. Yep, I was kind of a ham, even back then. My father was none too pleased when he discovered this. He made sure I learned to read well. My mother grew up as the daughter of devout Catholics. She didn't like her first name, Bertha. Maybe it's because there was a famous lady at the circus named Bertha who was known for her substantial girth. But I guess her parents weren't aware of that. She preferred to be called Bert. When she was a little girl, she decided she wanted to marry a man whose name was Joseph, because that was the foster father of Jesus. Later on, her older brother started working in San Francisco for a Catholic magazine, and they met a young man who worked there whose name was Joseph. They set up a date, but my mother decided this was not the right Joseph for her. However, on the second date, she changed her mind. You may want to keep that in mind the next time you have a so-so first date. They settled in the Bay Area of California. I was their firstborn, coming into the world on August 21st, 1919. They named me Dolores Bertha. 2.5 years later, my brother Ed arrived. 4 years after him came Raymond. Our grandfather lived with us as well. I thought sometimes this must have been tough on my parents, but I'm sure it was nice for them to have an extra babysitter. It's a Catholic tradition in my mother's native region of Alsace-Lorraine that after a child is born, the mother takes the baby to a church to be dedicated to the Blessed Virgin Mary. The ritual dictates that the mother has to wait until 40 days after the baby is born, so she's clean again. My mother performed this ritual with me and my brothers. Another part of the tradition is that the child is supposed to wear blue for the first 7 years if it's a daughter, and for 3 years if it's a son. I used to wear baby bonnets with roses on them, and my mother had to switch them all out for blue ones. My mother often said she changed more roses on my bonnets than she had time for. Both my parents came from big families. My mother had 3 sisters and 2 brothers, although her mother lost several other children at birth. My father had 6 sisters and 2 brothers, as well as a 3rd brother who died when he was 21. My father was the only one of his siblings who got married and had children. All of his brothers and sisters lived in the same house. They all worked except one sister, to whom they paid a salary to stay home and do all the cooking and cleaning. The upshot of all this is that my brothers and I had many uncles and aunts, but very few cousins. How spoiled we were! The family would come over to our house and dote on us, or we would go to their house and be the object of all their affections. Even though my grandpa lived with us, I was put in charge of my brothers a lot. I often tried to boss them around, but they also let me play with them and their friends. A big reason my brothers and I got along so well was that we never tattled on one another. If our parents asked us what was happening, we told them the truth. But if something went wrong between us, we took care of it ourselves. I felt responsible for Ed and Raymond and didn't want them to get into trouble, although it happened from time to time. For instance, one day a few older boys in town asked Ed, "Do you like fire engines?" He was 4 years old, so of course he said yes. They told him, "Well, if you pull the little button on that telephone pole over there, we'll see a lot of fire engines." This made him very excited. A boy lifted up Ed, and he pulled the lever. Sure enough, the fire engines came blaring. When they did, the other boys ran away. My brother got scared and ran home and crawled under the kitchen table. When my mother found him, he told her what had happened. Our doorbell rang and my mother opened the door to see a fireman standing there holding a little black book. He came inside, sat down, listened to my brothers tell his story, and jotted notes. He was very nice, but stern. "If this happens again," he said to my brother, "we will have to come back and have a different kind of conversation. Do you understand?" Those firemen never had to come back, that was for sure. There was only one time I remember when I got in real trouble with my parents. I got mad at my brother and kicked him. I didn't mean to hurt him, but it landed right on his shin, and he started bleeding. My mom talked to me about it, but she wasn't much for punishments. She would rather reason with us and let us think about what was right or wrong based on our conversation. There was another time when my brother Ed was 5 years old and he asked my mother if he could do something. When she said no, he called her an SOB. She took him into the bathroom, grabbed a bar of lavender soap, and washed his mouth with it. He started crying, which only created more soap bubbles. When it was over, Mom said to him gently, "Now, will you ever do that again?" He promised he wouldn't, and as far as I know, he never did. Ed would regularly get colds when he was young, which meant Raymond and I would often go to Mass on Saturday morning without him. On the way home, my uncle would give us a nickel or sometimes a dime so we could buy donuts. Ray and I would each eat one and save the third for Ed. Although I must confess, sometimes we thought he might be too sick to eat the donut, so we would eat it for him on the way home. May God forgive me. My dad's mother was an Irish Catholic girl named Kate Fogarty. His father was a Lutheran from Bavaria who converted to Catholicism on his deathbed. Before I began any kind of schooling, I knew how to make the sign of the cross, recite the Hail Mary, and say several childhood prayers. I never resisted any of this. It made me feel loved by my parents and by God. When I entered first grade, my parents naturally wanted to send me to Catholic school, but they didn't because my mother was pregnant with Raymond. I didn't know she was pregnant. Parents didn't talk about those things with their children back then. It was a 10-block walk to school, and the road went through Market Street. There were no stoplights, and my parents were worried I might be run over, even though there weren't many cars around in those days. So instead, I went to public school, which was only 2 blocks away. By second grade, they must have thought I'd grown up enough to walk myself, so I started my Catholic education at Most Holy Redeemer School on Diamond Street. Tuition was $2 a month for me and $1 per month for each of my brothers. My dad always insisted we pay in silver dollars because many of the nuns were from Chicago, and he didn't think they had ever seen silver dollars, which were minted in San Francisco. The school went from 1st through 8th grade. I loved school and wanted to do all my lessons well. I was an ordinary little girl who liked to have a good time, but if I didn't receive good grades, I felt disappointed. I worked very hard in school because I wanted to win a scholarship to St. Paul's High School so my mom and dad wouldn't have to pay tuition. Eventually, I did win the scholarship and went to the all-girls school. Growing up, I often enjoyed having company in the house. However, I didn't like that my mom had to work so hard to prepare food and be a good hostess. If I thought the guests were overstaying their visit, I would pipe up, "It's time for you to go home now." I was never one for holding my tongue. We took regular walks with my dad through Buena Vista Park after dinner. One night, my brothers and I asked him where we came from. He thought we were too young to hear the truth, so he said, "The doctor found you in a tree in Buena Vista Park. Then he took you to St. Joseph's Hospital and gave you to Mom." After that, there were quite a few times when my brothers and I would run around the park looking in those trees trying to find the newborn babies. My dad would simply shake his head and say, "Looks like we got here a little too late." Although we knew our parents were in charge, I wouldn't describe them as strict. They didn't enforce a lot of rules. However, some rules were harder to follow than others. There was a door to the living room that they kept locked in the days leading up to Christmas. My father said it was Santa's workshop. One year it was getting close to the big day, and my mom had to do some last-minute shopping. She left us at home with my grandfather. I was playing outside, and my grandfather got worried because my brothers were so quiet, so he went inside to see what they were up to. My brothers, wily devils that they were, figured out that the same skeleton key that opened the bathroom door worked on the living room door as well. My brothers ran outside excitedly and told me they saw they were getting bicycles. When Christmas came, my father sadly informed my brothers that Santa Claus had not brought them any presents. He didn't explain why. My brothers were so crushed that I started to cry too, but my dad kept up the ruse. "I don't understand why Santa didn't bring you what you asked for while you sat on his lap," he said. Finally, my brothers fessed up. They admitted to using the key to go into the living room. My father told them how disappointed he was. He already knew about it, of course, and they all agreed this was why Santa took back the presents. Our family came over for dinner that night. As we were eating, our front doorbell rang. My father got up to answer it. When he returned, he said, "You'll never guess who was at the door." "Santa!" My brothers' little faces lit up. They ran into the living room, and sure enough, their bicycles were there. Apparently, Santa heard their confession, believed they had done their penance, and forgave them. When Ed became a teenager, he joined a group that called themselves the Sheiks. I guess that would be considered a gang today, but they didn't cause any trouble. They did think they were pretty suave, though. When I was growing up, we didn't see our friends after school. We said goodbye and walked home. And we certainly didn't call our friends when we got home. Although we had a phone in our house, we shared the line with our neighbors. Sometimes we'd pick up the phone and hear other people talking. Later on, even when we had our own phone, we had to put a nickel in the slot if we wanted to use it. Then the Great Depression happened and we couldn't afford that, so we had the phone removed. Like a lot of people who lived through the Depression, our family learned to appreciate what we had and also what we had to give up. We didn't go out to dinner unless it was a very, very special occasion. We'd go to an Italian restaurant, and the whole meal would cost $2.50. During that time, my dad was fortunate to keep his job as a janitor at the San Francisco Civic Auditorium. That and City Hall were the two largest buildings in the city. The auditorium held many wonderful events. There was ice skating, bicycle races, graduations, the fireman's ball, the policeman's ball, and more. Later, the city constructed a veterans building and an opera house, and my dad was moved into a position as a civic administrator. He became a very important official in the city. Every year when the city held a big luncheon for its workers, it was pointed out that we were the family with the most people on staff. 2 of my aunts were public school teachers. One taught first grade for 45 years, the other taught junior high. One of my uncles was in housekeeping at City Hall. The other drove a truck for the sanitation department. We were San Franciscans through and through. It wasn't just a big city for us, it was our community. Looking back, it was very impressive my dad was able to provide so well for his family, considering his education didn't extend beyond his junior year of high school. Instead, he had to go to work. My mom only went to school through 7th grade. It always amazed me how much psychology my mom knew, even though she had never learned it in school. As I said before, from the very start, I was an eager student in school. I thought I had the answers to everything. Once, a priest came to our class to talk about the 10 Commandments. Moses had 2 tablets, he said, but there were 7 commandments on one and 3 on the other. Does anyone know why? No one raised a hand. I couldn't let everyone sit in silence like that, could I? I shot my hand in the air. Well, 7 plus 3 is 10, I said, so whatever the reason, God got it right. Although the actual answer is that the first 3 refer to God, and the other 7 refer to man. My answer sounded pretty good at the time, at least to me. Everywhere I turned, I was encouraged to reinforce my belief in the goodness and grace of God, that He always gets it right. I realize it's not easy for people to maintain belief, especially after someone they love dies. For those who respond to those situations by turning away from faith, I would suggest that maybe they should give God a second date. As painful as it is to lose someone we love, it's our mission to trust that God has His reasons for calling them home. That call will come for all of us. We just don't know when. God is full of surprises. Most of them are pleasant, but many are not. Either way, death is out of our control. The only thing we can do in those moments is hold as hard as we can to believe. I was especially close with my paternal grandmother, Kate. She was an active churchgoer and would often take me to a German church in San Francisco called St. Boniface. Not only did she go to services often, she also went to almost every funeral in her parish, whether she knew the person well or not. When I asked her why, she replied, "Because not everyone has family. If I go to the funeral, I know that I am there to pray and pay my respects." There was an important lesson in there for me. Sometimes the most important part of love is showing up. 2. The blessings of acceptance. It's important to help others be happy. I grew up in what is now known as the Castro district of San Francisco. It was a very Catholic city back then. To this day, there are many churches that were originally built by Italian and Irish immigrants. People came to America to be Americans, but they also brought their cultures from home. It made for a wonderful neighborhood featuring a melange of flavors from across the world. Our neighborhood comprised more than just Catholics. In fact, there was a strict Mormon family that lived right across the street from us. I felt sorry for them because it seemed like they had to do a lot of difficult stuff. For instance, one Sunday a month, the dad tithed to their church, which meant his family couldn't have breakfast that day because money was tight. My parents were incredibly understanding and accepting people. From the start, they emphasized to my brothers and me the idea that we should accept everyone no matter who they are, what they believe, who they love, and how they pray. We were not to look down on anyone for not being Catholic or for being less Catholic than we were. We didn't talk disparagingly about anybody who was different. If we had, I'm sure our parents wouldn't have stood for it. They emphasized that God made every one of us out of love. My mom told us, we need to love God back because He made you out of love. We have so much for which to be grateful. My dad would add, people may believe in a different kind of God. Maybe they look at Him in a different way, but it's still the same God. My dad looked at the earth and the trees and the water and knew that only God could make such beautiful things. There was no other possible explanation. I don't recall my parents ever using the word diversity. We were taught to be so accepting of differences that we hardly noticed them. All the kids in the neighborhood played together, boys and girls. We enjoyed playing touch football. Usually the teams were co-ed, but sometimes we played boys against the girls. We girls always wanted to beat the boys, that's for sure. But I don't remember there ever being a single fight. Most of the kids I knew went to public school. I was blessed to be raised in a community filled with immigrants from all over the world. This taught me the importance of acceptance. If you didn't accept the differences between your neighbors, you were going to have a hard time getting along. There were several French families in our neighborhood who sent their kids to French schools. There were also a lot of Chinese and Japanese people living in San Francisco. We loved going to Chinatown. We had Japanese twins in our first grade class named Mizuki and Mizaki. When we took our class picture, the two of them stood at opposite sides, like bookends. There were not many black people living in our neighborhood at that time, however. Most of the black people in the Bay Area lived in Oakland, where the fathers often worked as longshoremen. Their children went to school over there, but in time a few black families moved closer to us. My aunt, who was a first-grade teacher, had a black girl in her class named Helen. My aunt thought it was important for me and my brothers to spend time with people who were different, so she invited Helen over for dinner. I remember we had our picture taken together, and I thought Helen was a very sweet girl. Sadly, I think our society has become more suspicious since then. People point to groups of other people and say they are the cause of so much trouble. Although that's not true, it's become the reaction to seeing people who come from a different culture. That's unfortunate. I wish we could be more accepting of one another. My elementary school, Most Holy Redeemer, doesn't exist as a school anymore, but the church still stands. It now describes itself as an inclusive Catholic community and is considered one of the foremost parishes for LGBTQ people in the entire world. There were a lot of gay men living in our community when I was growing up, although I'm not sure I understood exactly what that meant at the time. I did know that some of the adults in town were concerned about them. We were told that if one of those men followed us to school or tried to talk to us, we should report them to our teachers or someone in authority. Many of those fellows would talk to us after school, and I thought they were very nice. Finally, one day I said to my dad, "You know, these guys are always talking to us, but they seem okay." My dad replied, "If anybody tried to harm you, those men would be the first ones to help." I don't pretend to know what God thinks about everything, but I do believe He created each one of us out of love. It's up to us to learn to accept people, no matter how different they are. Acceptance has to come from the heart. If we see someone who is different, we should try to remind ourselves that God created us just as unique as that person. I see people express harsh feelings toward those from other cultures, and it breaks my heart. We forget that Jesus made friends with everybody. He would cure anybody who came along, even though it made the scribes and the Pharisees angry. This shows how accepting He was, and that should be our example. My parents constantly reinforced this notion, not only with their words, but more importantly, through their actions. Neighbors were truly neighbors in our day. We knew everyone on our block. The parents all knew one another, and all the kids played together, even if we didn't go to the same school. When I was 10, we moved into a house that had a garage. On Monday nights, my dad would host what he called his Blue Jamboree. He took his radio and attached it to a big megaphone so everyone could hear. He'd set up chairs for the neighbors, and they would all come and listen to the music. He wanted to create that sense of community. We thought our dad was the smartest guy on the block. My mom was also a very happy person. She always found solutions to problems. That was especially important during the Great Depression. My brothers and I would help my mom bring the groceries home from the store. We'd ask, "Do you think we can have an ice cream cone today?" Those cones cost a nickel, and oftentimes she didn't have one. So she'd answer, "I don't think we can today, but when we get home, I'll make some snickerdoodles. How does that sound?" She tried not to say no to us unless she had to, but when she did, that was okay. Boys and girls have to hear the word no sometimes. Still, she didn't like to say it. This meant sometimes she'd say instead, "Ask your father." When we'd ask Dad, he'd say, "I think you better ask your mother." During the Depression, we knew we couldn't have everything we wanted. My mother would send us to the store with 5 cents. We would buy vegetables, which she would make into a big pot of soup that lasted for 2 days. Then she'd send us with another 5 cents to the butcher to buy meat bones. We skimped as best we could, but my dad was insistent that we would always pay our school tuition. We still attended Mass regularly and gave what little we had to the church. Through it all, we learned the value of money. During this time, despair was all around, and people were desperate to get by. I remember one of my aunts was robbed on her way home from work. You could look into the hills and see people sleeping there. We called them hobos. I was too young to really understand, so I don't think I was necessarily frightened, but I knew that something was not right. However, I also saw a lot of goodness in our community. People had block parties and shared their food and vegetables with their neighbors. We never visited anyone's house without bringing something. Even in the worst of times, people wanted to help one another. After our phone was disconnected, our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Krager, told my mom, "Whenever you want to use the telephone, just come on over, and you can give my number to your friends in case of emergency. If someone calls here for you, I'll let you know." It was a good lesson for me at a young age. Times may be bad, but people are still good. When I was about 10 years old, I overheard a conversation at a picnic indicating that an older girl we knew named Anne-Marie was going to have a baby. I said to my mom, "How can Anne-Marie have a baby if she's not married?" My mom replied, "I don't want you to worry about Anne-Marie. She's going to have the baby and she's going to be a very good mother." Looking back, I think that was her way of telling me that Anne-Marie was not going to have an abortion. She was telling me in so many words that I shouldn't consider myself superior because of what Anne-Marie was experiencing. My mom always told us that if we saw people in trouble, we should care for them and try to help, and that if we were good to other people, they would be good to us. I believe we should be tolerant of other people's mistakes. St. Paul and St. Peter made mistakes. Peter denied Jesus. That was a big one. Too often we think of God as a very stern judge. I think in many ways, though, we're getting back to the spirit of acceptance in the church. Still, sometimes people are so overpowering in their religion, it's a challenge for others to listen. But you can't be tough on everybody. It's like a mother who has many children. She can't treat them all the same, but she can love them all the same. Many churches are having a harder time getting people to come for services, especially younger people. We have to do better. If we don't welcome and love our young people through their tough times, I'm worried we might lose a generation. I get sad when somebody makes a mistake. I don't like to say they did something wrong. I call it a mistake. I pray that the person will find a path toward joy and happiness, but that doesn't mean I condemn or judge them. You have to live according to the way you believe. Believe in life. Believe in God. Believe in the future. In doing so, it's important to help others find happiness. As I look back on those early years, I can see where I was given a foundation that continues to serve me to this day. My office at Loyola is in the Student Union and has a nice window and a door that is always open. From where I sit behind my desk, I can see the students come and go. They sit at the tables to congregate, eat, and study. They see me in my office and know they can come in and talk to me anytime. People wander in and out all day. The phone is constantly ringing. There's a steady buzz of activity all around. In many ways, that office is like my father's garage. I may not have a radio with a megaphone as he did, but I'm part of a lovely neighborhood. San Francisco didn't feel like a big city when I was young. Developers were afraid that if they put up too many buildings, the buildings would be destroyed by earthquakes. If you wanted to go across the bay, you had to take a ferry. I loved riding the ferry. We'd drive our car onto the boat and ride across. We had a star car in those days. It was built by the Durant Motor Company during the 1920s as a competitor to the Ford Model T. Before my mom married, she used a horse and a motorcycle to get around. Yes, a motorcycle. That changed when they built the Golden Gate Bridge. We went out there often and watched them build it. The men would go out on those catwalks and work all the time, including weekends, because they were in a hurry to get it done. We would ride by the building site and marvel at how those men worked up so high using the suspension cables. I thought I'd get terribly dizzy if I tried that. It was very exciting when they opened the bridge to the public on May 27, 1937. They let everyone walk across. I had to pay a nickel, but my mom paid a quarter. It was an exciting day, but I was sad I wouldn't be riding the ferry anymore. I had always looked forward to that. Back then, most moms didn't work, but when I was in 7th grade, my mom got a job as a clerk in the Weinstein Company department store on Market Street. During that time, my brothers and I had to help a lot more with the housework and figure out how to help our dad. After a couple of weeks, Mom started getting bad headaches. My father suggested she leave the job because it was causing her too much stress. To make things easier on her, he had us do laundry on Sundays. I mentioned to him that as Catholics, we weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. He smiled and said, "God will understand." My family had an ark. No, there was no great flood or many pairs of animals on board, but it was a wonderful place for all the relatives to get together. My dad and his brother bought the ark for $625. It was docked on a main tributary of the San Francisco Bay. They felt like it was too expensive to travel and go on vacations all the time, so this became our vacation spot for the entire family. The name of the ark was Pastime. There were sleeping ports and a nice living room, bedroom, and kitchen. There was a stove, a refrigerator, and a few other appliances on board. The hull was filled with mud to keep the ark from floating away. When the tide came in, we would all go swimming. We made wonderful memories with that ark over many decades. There was a bridge nearby that led to hills that were owned by the Archdiocese of San Francisco. It was a great place to hike, but we had to go early in the morning before it got too hot. My grandfather and I would get up at 5 a.m. and go pick blackberries. We'd bring them back to the ark, and my mom would make a pie for dinner. I can still remember the smell of that kitchen when she cooked them. We also had a motorboat. My dad used it to take us out fishing on the bay. We would pass San Quentin Prison. Some days, you could see the inmates playing basketball during their recreation time. Once in a while, the sirens from the prison would go off, which meant a prisoner had escaped. We'd be scared out of our wits and run back to the ark, hoping the guy wouldn't show up. During this time, we had a pet monkey named Jerry. We got Jerry from a friend who was an engineer on a cargo boat that made trips to South America. Jerry was small, but very active. He got nervous if there were too many people around, so we kept him in a cage in the basement. He was used to the heat, and he became uncomfortable when the weather in San Francisco turned cold, so my mom made him a red sweater to keep him warm. She also gave him a baby blanket, which she would wrap around him when he slept. We weren't sure what to feed him, but our friend from the boat said they had fed the monkey coffee and toast. That's what he had every morning. He especially liked it when my mom put sugar in his coffee. He'd dip his toast in the coffee and eat it, then hold 2 hands on the cup and take a sip. Jerry liked women more than men, and if he smelled liquor on anybody, he squealed like you wouldn't believe. I guess he was a teetotaler. My dad built Jerry a cage outside so he could play in it. He had a little swing and a slide, and he jumped around all day. The kids in the neighborhood loved coming over to play with him, and my mom would bring him into school so the sisters and all the kids could see him. We had Jerry for about 5 years until one day somebody cut a hole in the top of the cage and stole him. We were heartbroken. Our next pet was a puppy. He was adorable, but he cried all night long, so my dad gave him back. We never got another dog. We did, however, have a chicken pen outside our house. We had 3 chicks, 3 ducks, and 3 rabbits. Our aunts and uncles would occasionally come over with another animal for the pen. There was a deep well in the hills near us where we could go fishing. If we gave the man who owned the land a nickel, we could keep all the goldfish we caught. We were very lucky our parents bought a house when I was 2, not only so we could have a menagerie of pets, but also because it helped us financially. We owned a 2-story flat and rented out the first floor for $25 a month. It helped us get through the Depression. It became my job to ask the tenants for the rent money. I guess that made me the muscle of the family. I have been blessed in more ways than I could possibly count, but being born into such a large family is definitely near the top of the list. I was never bored, never lonely, and I never had any doubt what was expected of me. I was taught from the start that loving and caring for family was an important part of serving God. I'm grateful for the memories, and especially for the values my relatives passed along. They wanted me to be accepting, loving, and kind to everyone I met. Many of those family members are gone now, but I'd like to believe that I'm still carrying on their legacy. Wherever I go, whatever I do, their love and teachings, and the Ark, is always with me, still keeping me afloat.
Thank you for spending time with us, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of Listen Here. Check back next week for more audiobook samples and maybe a special guest or two. Follow us wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on Instagram and TikTok at Listen Here Podcast. Visit our website, listenhearepodcast.com, for more information or to find the books we've talked about. See you next week.